The gun was already in her hand when Elias Walden kicked open the door. He had expected to find a terrified woman cowering behind an overturned table, which was what Marshal Deakins had told him he would find. He had expected tears, maybe hysterics, possibly a woman who had fainted clean away from the shock of having 3 armed men attempt to force their way into the only boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas. What he had not expected was Louisa Finley standing at the center of the room with a Winchester Model 1873 rifle braced against her shoulder, her dark eyes flat and absolutely steady, the barrel pointed at the throat of one Hector Briggs, who was currently pressed against the far wall with his hands raised and his face the color of old lard. 2 of Briggs's men were already on the floor, not dead. She had been careful about that. One had a neat crease along his left temple, where the bullet had passed close enough to knock him unconscious, and the other had a shattered knee that would heal in time, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his miserable life. She had made her choices with surgical precision, and the math of those choices was written plainly across the room for anyone with eyes to read it. Elias Walden stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds with his own revolver half drawn, and in those 3 seconds something happened inside his chest that he would spend the next 6 months trying to name before he gave up and admitted it was the beginning of love. "You can put that away," Louisa said, without taking her eyes off Briggs. Her voice was low and controlled, with just the faintest trace of something Eastern in the vowels. "I have the situation in hand." "I can see that," Elias said. He holstered his revolver. Briggs made a small, desperate sound. "Marshal, she is out of her mind. She is going to kill me." "Hush," Louisa said pleasantly. Briggs hushed. Elias stepped over the man with the shattered knee and came to stand beside her, close enough that he could see the pulse beating in her throat. Fast, but not panicked. The pulse of someone who had been frightened and chosen to do something about it rather than surrender to the fear. He looked at the rifle, noted the way she held it, noted the position of her finger on the trigger, and understood that he was standing next to someone who had handled a firearm for a very long time and knew exactly what she was doing with one. "Who are you?" he asked. She did not look at him. "Who are you?" "Elias Walden. I ride for the marshal's office." "Then you can arrest those 3 men. They broke my lock, destroyed my traveling trunk, and intended to take something that does not belong to them." A pause, fractional, barely there. "Among other things." The last 2 words carried a weight that made Elias' jaw tight. He looked at Briggs. "You want to tell me what you were after?" Briggs said nothing, which was the smartest thing he had done since walking into the situation. "Take them," Louisa said. "I will lower my rifle when they are in your custody and not a moment before." Elias almost smiled. He went and got Briggs by the collar instead, and he thought, as he marched 3 broken men out into the late afternoon light of a Kansas September, that he needed to find out who Louisa Finley was, where she had come from, and why a woman who shot like that had come west to a town like Caldwell carrying a rifle, a battered trunk, and an expression that suggested she had already seen the worst the world had to offer and had declined to be destroyed by it. He had no idea yet that she was also carrying her grandmother's locket, and that the locket was the reason Hector Briggs and his men had come through her door. He had no idea yet that the locket contained a secret that would pull both of them into a web of land fraud, hidden wills, and betrayal so deep it went back 20 years and stretched from Ohio all the way to the raw red dirt of the Oklahoma Territory. He had no idea yet that by the time the whole thing unraveled, he would have given up sleep, comfort, the good opinion of his employer, and very nearly his own life to stand beside this woman. But that comes later. First, you need to understand how Louisa Finley got here. She had grown up in Columbus, Ohio, in a narrow house on a wide street, the only daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died of a fever when Louisa was 11 years old. The loss had been immense, the kind that reshapes a child's interior landscape entirely. And what it had reshaped Louisa into was someone who read everything she could get her hands on, questioned everything she was told, and decided at the age of 14 that she was going to be useful in the world in some measurable, concrete way. Her father, William Finley, was a gentle man with ink-stained fingers and a genuine respect for intellect regardless of the sex it inhabited. He had taught her mathematics the way other fathers taught their sons, seriously and with the expectation that she would master it, and she had. By the time she was 18, she was doing surveying calculations in her head that experienced men had to work out on paper. By 22, she held a certificate from the Ohio Land Survey School, one of only 4 women to complete the program in its 20-year history, and the only one to finish with the highest marks in geometric calculation, land measurement, and topographic mapping. Her grandmother, Ida Mee Finley, had been the one to hand her the locket on the morning Louisa left for Kansas. Ida Mee was 81 years old, sharp as a new fence post, and dying of something she refused to have named. She pressed the locket into Louisa's palm with a grip that still had surprising strength in it and said, "This goes with you, girl. It has always gone west when it was needed." Louisa had looked at the locket. It was oval, silver, worn smooth in the places where hands had held it most often, and it opened to reveal a tiny portrait of a woman Louisa did not recognize on one side, and on the other side, a folded piece of paper so thin it was nearly translucent, covered in handwriting so small it required a magnifying glass to read. "What is this?" Louisa had asked. "Protection," Ida Mee had said. "Also evidence. When you get to Caldwell, find the land office and ask for the survey records for a parcel called the Clearwater Grant. Then open the locket and read what is inside. You will understand. Grandmother, you need to explain." "I am explaining. I am just doing it in the right order." Ida Mee had closed Louisa's fingers over the locket. "Your great-uncle Silas filed that grant in 1868. A man named Aldous Briggs told him the grant was invalid, took the land, and had Silas run off the territory at gunpoint. Silas died the following winter. Your great-uncle was a good man who deserved better, and that land should have come to your father and through your father to you. The paper inside that locket is the original survey record, the one Aldous Briggs claimed had been lost." Louisa had stared at her grandmother for a long moment. "Aldous Briggs. Hector Briggs is his son," Ida Mee said. "He runs the land operation now. He has expanded it considerably. He knows there is a woman coming west with Silas's survey. He does not know her name. He does not know what she looks like. But he knows she is coming because I told him so in a letter. I wanted him afraid." "Grandmother," Louisa had said carefully, "you told the man who stole our land that someone was coming to reclaim it." "I am old," Ida Mee had said, not without satisfaction. "I have the privilege of making men afraid without worrying about the consequences. You are young. You are better at this than I am. You will handle the consequences." She had died 3 days after Louisa boarded the train west, so that was the shape of it. Louisa had come to Caldwell with her rifle, her surveying certificate, her grandmother's locket, and a legal claim to 1,400 acres of prime grazing land in the Oklahoma Territory that a corrupt family had held illegally for nearly 20 years. She had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday evening, Hector Briggs had figured out who she was, and his men had come through her door. The thing about Hector Briggs was that he had underestimated her because she was a woman, and because he was the kind of man who had spent his entire life underestimating women and had never once been corrected. He was about to be corrected. The marshal's office in Caldwell in September of 1880 was a single-story building with a tin roof that amplified the heat until the interior felt like the inside of a Dutch oven. Marshal Vernon Deakins was a square-built man in his late 50s with the florid complexion of someone who drank more than was good for him and the political instincts of someone who had survived in a border town for a long time. He listened to Elias' account of the situation at the boarding house with increasing discomfort. "Briggs is not going to stay in that cell," Deakins said. "He broke into a woman's room with 2 armed men," Elias said. He ought to stay in that cell for considerable time. His family has influence with the county judge. Marshal, I am telling you how things are, not how they ought to be. Deakins put his hat on. I will hold him 48 hours. After that, I cannot promise anything. Elias walked out of the marshal's office thinking very hard thoughts about the nature of frontier justice, and walked directly into Louisa Finley, who was coming up the steps with her rifle under her arm and her expression composed into something that a less perceptive man might have mistaken for calm. "Miss Finley," he said. "Mr. Walden." She stopped on the step below him, which put their eyes nearly level with each other. Hers were dark brown, almost black, and they had a quality of direct assessment in them that he found simultaneously uncomfortable and compelling. "I need to speak with Marshal Deakins about the legal status of my complaint." Just came from him, and he could have softened it. He chose not to, partly because he respected her too much after the last hour to condescend to her, and partly because he had a feeling she would see through any softening immediately and think less of him for attempting it. "He will hold Briggs 48 hours. The county judge is friendly with the Briggs family." Her expression did not change visibly, but something moved behind her eyes, not despair, something colder and more purposeful. "I see. And you, what is your assessment of the situation?" "Assessment is that you need to file your legal claim at the land office before Briggs gets out of that cell and finds a way to complicate the paperwork. I was planning to do exactly that." "Good. I will come with you." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement. "Why?" "Because Briggs had 2 more men besides the ones who came through your door, and they are still loose in town, and you are carrying something he wants badly enough to commit a crime for." A pause. She studied him the way a surveyor studies new terrain, taking measurements, calculating angles, assessing for hidden obstacles. "Very well," she said at last. "But I want to be clear that I am not a woman who requires a guardian, Mr. Walden. I require a witness, possibly an ally. Those are different things." "I understand the difference," Elias said, and the strange thing was he did. The Caldwell land office was run by a man named Percy Hutchins, who was also the town's notary and part-time telegraph operator, and who wore 3 pairs of spectacles simultaneously, each pushed to a different level on his nose for different tasks. He received them with mild suspicion that shifted to active nervousness when Louisa stated her business. "The Clearwater grant," he said very carefully. "That is a Briggs holding." "It is not," Louisa said. "It was fraudulently claimed. I have the original survey document and I need it certified and registered." She opened the locket with the ease of long practice and extracted the folded paper with steady hands. She laid it on the counter. "You will see this is a legitimate survey record, dated June 14, 1868, bearing the seal of the United States General Land Office, recording the grant of 1,423 acres to one Silas Nathaniel Finley, my great-uncle. Deceased." Hutchins stared at the paper the way a man stares at something he very much wishes were not in front of him. He pushed the middle pair of spectacles up and leaned in. "This is—" He stopped. "Yes," Louisa said. "This is the document that Aldous Briggs reported lost in the fire of 1869. "There was no fire," Louisa said. "There was a man who wanted land that did not belong to him and was willing to lie about the circumstances under which he obtained it. The document was not lost. It was hidden by my grandmother, who kept it for 12 years until it could be delivered here." She folded her hands on the counter with the patience of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. "I want it certified and logged, today, before 5 o'clock, while the man who sent armed men to steal it from me is sitting in your town jail." Hutchins looked at Elias. Elias looked back without expression. Hutchins looked at the document again, then at the very composed, very determined young woman on the other side of his counter, and made the decision that whatever happened afterward, he was not going to be the man who had refused to certify a legitimate legal document. "I will need to verify the seal," he said. "Of course," Louisa said. "Take your time." While Hutchins verified the seal, Elias stood near the door and watched the street. The afternoon was doing what September afternoons in Caldwell did, which was to bake everything to a uniform dusty gold under a sky that went on too long in every direction. A dog was sleeping under the water trough. Two cowboys were leaning against the rail outside the saloon across the street, and one of them had been watching the land office door for the past 10 minutes with an attention that was not casual. "Miss Finley," Elias said quietly, "how long does this certification process take?" "As long as the clerk requires," Louisa said, equally quiet, "because we may have company before it is finished." She did not look toward the window. She already knew. He could tell by the slight shift in her posture, the way her right hand had moved an inch closer to the rifle she had set on the counter beside the locket. "Then I suggest you keep watch," she said, "while I finish what I came here to do." Hutchins, to his lasting credit, worked as fast as a man with 3 pairs of spectacles ever worked. He certified the document, logged it in the register, stamped it with the land office seal, and provided Louisa with a certified copy inside of 25 minutes. He also, without being asked, sent a telegraph to the United States General Land Office in Washington recording the transaction, which was either an act of conscientiousness or an act of self-preservation or both. The two cowboys from across the street were on the move by the time Louisa folded the certified copy into her coat. Elias put his hand on the door before she could reach for it. "There is a back way out of this building," he said. "Is there? Percy, is there a back door?" "Through the storeroom," Hutchins said, already sweating visibly. They went through the storeroom and out into the alley behind Main Street, and they walked 3 blocks north through the back ways of Caldwell before cutting west toward the boarding house through a route that involved a laundry, a chicken yard, and a gap between 2 buildings that was barely wide enough to walk through single file. "You know this town well," Louisa observed, as they pressed through the gap. "I have been riding out of it for 3 years, Elias said from behind her. He was very aware of the narrowness of the space, of the way her shoulder brushed the opposite wall, of the fact that he was looking at the back of her neck where a few dark strands of hair had come loose from their pins. He looked away. "You get to know a town's bones when you're coming and going from it regularly. What do you ride for, besides the marshal's office?" "I have a small ranch," he said, "east of town. Nothing like what you are claiming in the territory, but it is mine." "You built it yourself?" "I did." She emerged from the gap into a wider alley and turned to look at him. The late light caught the silver of the locket where it rested against the dark fabric of her coat. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me? You do not know me." The marshal was not enthusiastic about the situation. "You could have filed a report and gone home." Elias considered the question seriously, which was the only way he knew how to consider things. "Because what you described happening to your family is wrong," he said. "Land fraud is not a small crime. It ruins people. It kills people." He paused. "And because when I walked through that door and you had your rifle up and those men were already down, I thought, whatever else this woman is, she is not wrong." Something shifted in her expression. It was not softness exactly. It was more like the recognition of something genuine, as though she had been expecting flattery or condescension and had received neither and was recalibrating accordingly. "Elias Walden," she said, "were you born in Kansas?" "Tennessee," he said, "came west in '73. "Why?" He looked at her for a moment, deciding how much truth to offer. "Dark past," he said simply. "War's aftermath, things I needed to put distance between myself and." She nodded once, not pressing, and that restraint told him something about her that all the rifle handling in the world would not have told him. She understood what it meant to carry something you did not want examined. "I am Louisa Finley," she said, as though they had not been introduced. "I am 26 years old. I am a licensed land surveyor. I have come to reclaim 1,400 acres that belong to my family, and I intend to build something on it." "Build what?" "A future," she said. "I have not decided the exact shape of it yet." A pause so brief it was almost not there. "Thank you for your help today, Mr. Walden." "Elias." Another pause longer. "Elias," she said. The next 48 hours were the 48 hours before everything exploded. Hector Briggs sat in his cell and sent word through his lawyer. a slick man named Carter who had ridden in from Wichita, that the certified document was fraudulent, and that the Clearwater grant was and had always been Briggs' family property. Carter filed a counterclaim with the land office that same evening. Hutchins, presented with two conflicting claims, did what bureaucrats throughout history have done when faced with a situation that might cost them personally. He suspended both filings pending review by the county judge, who was friendly with the Briggs family. Louisa heard this news over breakfast the next morning with the expression of someone who had anticipated it but hoped to be surprised. She sat across from Elias at the table of Mrs. Clara Holt's boarding house, which was also the establishment where she was staying, and where Elias, after a brief conversation with Mrs. Holt involving $2 and a promise to behave himself, had taken the room at the end of the hall. "The county judge," she said. "Judge Raymond Ferris," Elias confirmed, "has been friendly with the Briggs family for at least a decade, possibly longer. Is he corruptible in our direction?" Elias almost choked on his coffee. "You are direct. I am practical. Is he?" "No. He is what you might call comprehensively bought. Whatever the Briggs family has promised him, he is not in the habit of looking for better offers." He set down his cup. "But there is a circuit judge, Judge Harold Ames out of Topeka. He comes through this district 3 times a year. He is due in Caldwell in approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks." She turned her fork over in her fingers, a restless movement that was the first fidgeting he had seen from her. "Briggs will be out of the jail by tomorrow evening. He will spend 6 weeks doing everything he can to invalidate my claim or buy out the witnesses or find some other way to make the problem disappear." "Yes. Which means I need to spend 6 weeks doing everything I can to make the claim airtight before Judge Ames arrives." "Yes." She set down the fork. "I need to survey the land myself. If I can produce fresh survey maps showing the exact boundaries of the Clearwater grant, corroborated by current topographical features, it becomes much harder to argue that the original document is fraudulent. No forger could have known the exact lay of land they had never seen." Elias looked at her. "That land is in the Oklahoma Territory. That is 3 days' ride south of here. I am aware of geography. The Briggs family has men across that territory. And the territory itself is not exactly civilized in the way that Caldwell is civilized." "Caldwell is not particularly civilized," she said. "I had armed men come through my door on my second night here." He conceded the point. "I am saying it is dangerous." "Everything is dangerous," Louisa said. "Sitting here for 6 weeks and letting Briggs buy the judge and lose the land is also dangerous. It is simply a different kind of dangerous." She looked at him steadily. "I am going to survey that land. I would like you to come with me. Not because I cannot go alone, but because having a representative of the marshal's office present will complicate any argument that the survey was conducted improperly." Elias thought about his ranch, which needed attention. He thought about the 3 horses he had been meaning to break, and the fence line that needed repair, and the fact that Marshal Deakins was not going to be pleased about him riding south on personal business. Then he thought about Louisa Finley standing at the center of a room with a rifle at her shoulder, absolutely steady, and the way she had said thank you afterward without making it sound like a debt. "I will need to make arrangements," he said. "Of course." She rose from the table, straightening her coat with the ease of someone accustomed to practical clothing rather than fashionable encumbrances. "We leave at first light tomorrow. I will need to acquire a horse. I have 3 extra horses at the ranch. You can ride one." She looked at him. Something in her expression briefly was something other than competence and resolve. It was warmer than that and more human, and it was gone quickly, replaced by the composed practicality that he was already learning to recognize as her natural armor against a world that had taught her, early and often, that she would have to earn every piece of ground she stood on. "Thank you," she said again. And then she went upstairs to pack, and Elias sat at the breakfast table for a while longer than was strictly necessary, looking at the place where she had been sitting. They rode out the next morning in the gray light before sunrise, when the prairie was cool, and the grass was silver with dew, and Caldwell was still mostly asleep. Louisa rode the sorrel mare Elias had brought from his ranch, and she rode her the way she handled everything else, with quiet, unhurried competence that made it look easy. She sat the saddle like she had been born in one, which surprised him, until she explained that her grandmother Ida Mee had been a horseback rider of some distinction, and had taught Louisa as soon as she was old enough to hold the reins. They had a pack horse loaded with camping supplies, Louisa's surveying equipment, which consisted of a compass, a transit level, a measuring chain, a set of field notebooks, and a collection of small wooden stakes that she had produced from her battered trunk, and enough provisions for 10 days. The first day's ride took them south through the gentle swells of the Kansas grassland, which was still green in places, but beginning to bronze at the edges the way it did in early fall. They talked as people talk on long rides, at intervals, when the silence became companionable enough that words felt like a natural addition rather than an interruption. Elias learned that Louisa had read more books than anyone he had ever met, that she had strong opinions about both mathematics and literature, that she believed the current treatment of the Kiowa and Cheyenne peoples in the territory was an injustice that would sit badly on the nation's conscience for a very long time, and that she had never been west of Columbus before this journey, and found the scale of the sky both terrifying and exhilarating. Louisa learned that Elias Walden had fought in the war on the Union side at 17, that he had come home to Tennessee to find his family's farm destroyed, and his younger brother dead of typhoid, that he had spent several years doing things he was not proud of before the West had given him a chance to become someone better, and that he was, beneath the quiet reserve and the marshal's deputy badge, a man who read everything he could find and thought carefully about what he read and formed opinions that were his own rather than borrowed from whoever was loudest in the room. "What dark past?" she asked, on the afternoon of the first day. "You said it back in Caldwell. Things you needed distance from." He was quiet for a moment. "After the war, I fell in with some men who were not careful about the line between what was mine and what belonged to other people. I was young, I was angry, and I told myself there were reasons." He looked out at the horizon, which was very far away and very wide. "There were not good enough reasons. I did enough to be ashamed of and not enough to be hanged for, and eventually I came to Kansas and decided that if I was going to carry a gun for the rest of my life, I was going to do it in service of something worth serving." "And do you," she asked, "find it worth serving?" "Most days," he said. "Today especially." She did not look at him when he said that, but he saw her chin come up slightly, and the corners of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. That night they camped near a creek that ran thin and bright over pale stones, and Louisa built a fire with an efficiency that he recognized and appreciated, and they ate the salt pork and hard bread that Mrs. Holt had packed for them, and afterward Louisa opened one of her field notebooks and began going over the measurements she would need to take when they reached the Clearwater parcel. Elias cleaned his revolver and watched her work, and was struck by the intensity of her concentration, the way her whole self seemed to gather around the problem she was solving the way a flame gathers around a wick. She moved the pencil with certainty, made calculations in the margin, cross-referenced something from memory, corrected herself once, and nodded. "You are doing the calculations in your head," he said. She looked up. "I beg your pardon." "You write the numbers down after you have already worked them out. I can tell by the speed. You are not calculating on the page, you are recording what you have already calculated up here." He touched his own temple. She looked at him with an expression of genuine surprise, as though she had not expected to be observed that closely. "Yes," she said, "I have always been able to do mathematics mentally. My father thought it was unusual. My professor at the survey school thought it was an asset. Most people do not notice." "I notice things," Elias said simply. She went back to her notebook. But the quality of the silence between them had changed, become slightly warmer, slightly less guarded, in the way that silences change when two people discover they are being seen. The second day brought them into territory that grew rougher and more dramatic, the land rolling up into low bluffs and cutting down into creek beds, the grass giving way in patches to red clay and scrub cedar. They crossed into the Oklahoma territory in the early afternoon, which was marked by no physical boundary but felt different nonetheless, the way places feel different when they have a different history under them. Louisa became more alert as they rode, her eyes moving over the terrain with a systematic attention that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with professional habit. She was mapping the land visually, filing it in the detailed internal catalog that made her what she was. "That ridge," she said, pointing northwest. "Do you know it?" "Red Cedar Ridge," Elias said, "runs about 4 miles east to west. There is a spring on the south face that runs year-round." Her eyes sharpened. "The Clearwater Grant is bounded on the north by a ridge feature. The original survey document describes a landmark the surveyor called Cedar Head." "That is Red Cedar Ridge," Elias said. "Cedar Head is what the old-timers called it." She turned to look at him fully, and the expression on her face in that moment was the closest thing to pure excitement he had yet seen from her. It transformed her features, made her look younger and more purely herself, as though the competence and composure were a coat she wore over something warmer and more alive. "Then we are already in the Grant boundary," she said. "We have been riding through my family's land for the past 20 minutes. There was something in the way she said it, "my family's land," that made Elias understand all at once why she had come so far for this. It was not just about justice, though justice was part of it. It was about belonging. It was about a place that had a name connected to her name, a piece of the world that was supposed to have been there waiting for her and had been stolen before she was old enough to know it existed. "Then, let us go find the rest of it," he said. The next 3 days were among the most interesting of Elias Walden's life, and he had lived an interesting life by the standards of the time. He had known surveyors. They were methodical men with careful equipment, and a way of moving across the land that was systematic, but also somehow mechanical, as though they were imposing a grid on the world rather than discovering what was already there. Louisa surveyed as though she were reading a language she had been born knowing. She moved through the terrain with her compass and her transit, taking sightings and measurements and recordings in her field notebooks, and she did it with a speed and accuracy that he found genuinely extraordinary. On the second morning in the territory, they were working along the eastern boundary of the Grant when Louisa stopped, looked at the measurement she had just taken, looked at the terrain, and then looked at her compass with a frown. "There is a discrepancy," she said. "What kind?" "The eastern boundary as described in the original survey should run along a natural drainage feature, a creek." She looked at the ground before them, which was flat and dry. "There is no creek here. There was a drought in '76, Elias said. "Some of the smaller creeks went underground or shifted course." "Went underground." She knelt and put her hand flat against the red clay. Then she looked up at the vegetation pattern, which he had never particularly noticed before, and suddenly he noticed it too, a slightly different color of grass, a line of willows 50 yards to the east that had no business being where they were in that dry landscape unless there was water close under the surface. "The creek went underground," she said. "Here." She walked east to the willows, following the subtle color change in the vegetation, pacing the distance in measured strides. 43 paces. "The eastern boundary runs 43 feet east of where I was standing along this subsurface drainage." "How can you know that for certain?" She pointed to the ground near the willow roots. "Seepage. The water table is 2 feet below the surface here at most. The willows are tapping it. In a wet year this is probably a running creek. In a dry year it goes underground, but it does not disappear, and the vegetation patterns follow it faithfully." She made a notation in her book. "This is actually better evidence than a visible creek. No one can argue that it was artificially moved. The geology follows the original survey record exactly." Elias stood next to her at the line of willows, looking at her profile as she wrote in her notebook, and felt the thing in his chest that he had been trying to name since the boarding house room do something decisive. It was not just attraction, though that was certainly present, and had been since approximately the moment she told him to put his revolver away. It was recognition. The specific, rare recognition of a person who was genuinely extraordinary, and the dawning understanding that extraordinary people were difficult and demanding and frequently inconvenient and worth every bit of the difficulty and demand and inconvenience. "Miss Finley," he said. "Louisa," she said without looking up. "You have been calling me Miss Finley for 2 days, and we have shared 3 campsites and 4 meals. It seems formal under the circumstances." "Louisa," he said. He liked the way it felt to say it. "I want you to know that what you just did, identifying a subsurface watercourse from vegetation patterns and surface seepage, I have been west for 7 years. I know men who have surveyed this territory professionally for longer than that. I have never seen anyone do what you just did." She looked up then. Her eyes did what they had done that evening at the fire, that brief moment of warmth that was more real than her composure. "I had a very good teacher," she said, "and I paid attention." That night, their 4th since leaving Caldwell, they made camp in the shelter of a sandstone outcropping on the western edge of the Grant, where the land dropped away into a long, shallow valley that would have been beautiful grazing country in a wet year. The fire was small and well sheltered, and the stars above them were the unobstructed stars of the open territory, brilliant and dense, and so many that they seemed not like individual points of light but like a single, overwhelming presence. Louisa had put her notebooks away for the evening and was sitting with her back against the sandstone, her knees drawn up, looking at the valley. She had unpinned her hair at some point, and it fell dark and loose around her shoulders, and she looked less armored than usual in a way that Elias found he had to work at not staring at. "What will you build here?" he asked. "When it is settled?" She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was thoughtful rather than decided. "I have imagined a working ranch," she said. "The land is good for grazing in the northern sections, but I have also thought that the terrain in the south, the more dramatic sections with the clay formations, those could be interesting for other purposes. Mineral survey. There may be coal seams in this part of the territory. I have seen the geological indicators." "You think about coal seams?" "I think about everything that might be useful," she said. "It is a habit." She paused. "My grandmother wanted me to have land because she grew up with people who had no land, and she understood what that meant. She wanted something solid and permanent and mine. I want that too, but I also want to build something that works, that produces something real." "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was the most remarkable person I have ever known." Louisa's hand moved to the locket which she wore around her neck. She spent 12 years keeping this piece of paper safe, planning for a future she knew she would not live to see. "She wrote to Hector Briggs to warn him, which I was furious about and have since come to respect enormously. She was not afraid of being afraid. She just decided what to do anyway." "Like her granddaughter," Elias said. She looked at him with an expression that was open in a way her expressions were not usually open, undefended and direct, and something close to grateful, not for the compliment but for the understanding behind it. "I am trying to be," she said. He moved without exactly deciding to. He was sitting 3 feet away, and then he was sitting beside her with the firelight between them and the sandstone at their backs, and she did not move away, which he took as the careful, considered permission it was. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why are you here? And I do not mean as a matter of logistics." "You rode away from your ranch, from your employment, from your comfortable life in Caldwell, to ride into a territory with a woman you did not know 2 days ago on the basis of—" She stopped. "On the basis of what, exactly?" "On the basis that what Briggs did to your family was wrong," he said. "And on the basis that you are the most capable, most clear-minded person I have met in 7 years of living in this territory, and that it seemed like a waste of considerable talent to let Hector Briggs steal your land again." "Those are not romantic reasons," she said. "I know. "I appreciate that," she said. "I have had romantic reasons directed at me before. They did not account for who I actually was." "I know who you are," Elias said, "or I am beginning to." She was quiet for a moment then. "Who am I?" "You are someone who carries your dead grandmother's fight in a silver locket and does not consider this a burden. You are someone who can read a subsurface watercourse from the color of dry grass. You are someone who memorizes survey calculations and keeps them in the front of your mind like a weapon. You are someone who shot a man in the knee rather than kill him because you had made a judgment about how much force was warranted." He paused. "You are someone who said thank you to me twice, both times like you meant it, neither time like you were performing it." She was looking at the fire when he finished. The locket caught the light. "I am also frightened," she said quietly. "In case that matters, I am frightened that Briggs will find a way to invalidate the claim. I am frightened that Judge Ames will be bought or scared. I am frightened that I will have come all this way and carried this locket all this distance and it will not be enough." "It is enough," Elias said. "You do not know that." "No," he admitted. "But I know that whatever the outcome, the effort was worth making. Your grandmother knew it too." He looked at the locket. "She sent you with protection, with evidence. She made sure you had everything she could give you. The rest is the territory's problem, not yours." Louisa turned to look at him. They were very close now, closer than they had been before except for the narrow gap between the buildings in Caldwell. And in the firelight her dark eyes were very clear, and the fear he had just heard in her voice had not gone away, but it had changed shape, become something less isolated, as though being witnessed had made it lighter. She kissed him, or he kissed her. Afterward, neither of them could have said exactly who had moved first, which seemed right, because it was the kind of moment that belonged to both of them equally. It was brief, careful, and completely sincere. When it ended, she leaned her head back against the sandstone and looked at the stars. "That was either a very good idea or a very complicated one," she said. "Probably both," Elias said. "Yes," she agreed. And she left her shoulder touching his, and they looked at the stars together, and the fire burned low, and the territory was vast and dark and full of unresolved problems, and neither of them felt particularly alone inside it. They completed the survey on the 6th day. Louisa had mapped every boundary feature, cross-referenced every topographical landmark, and produced a set of maps so detailed and precise that Elias, looking over her shoulder at the finished product, understood for the first time why land survey was called a science and not just a trade. "This is extraordinary," he said. She was binding the maps with string, her movements quick and efficient. "It is thorough," she said. "Thorough is more useful than extraordinary in court." "Both," he said. She gave him the sideways look that he was beginning to love, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite a laugh and was entirely her. "Can I see the transit calculation for the southwest corner? The one where the gulch makes the boundary irregular?" She handed him the notebook. He looked at the calculation. He looked at it for a long time. "You accounted for the magnetic declination," he said. "Of course. And you did not use standard tables. The standard tables for this region are based on measurements from 1865. The magnetic declination shifts over time. I used updated figures from an 1878 survey paper by Professor Langford at the University of Illinois." She paused. "Most surveyors do not bother. The difference is small in most cases. In a boundary that follows an irregular natural feature, the cumulative difference over 1,400 acres becomes significant." He set the notebook down and looked at her directly. She looked back. "What?" "Louisa," he said. "I was completely wrong when I said you were the most capable person I had met in 7 years. You are the most capable person I have ever met, including every man I have served with in any capacity in any profession, and I mean that without qualification." She stared at him. The color in her cheeks changed. She looked away, and then back, and he saw that she was genuinely affected by this. Not in a self-conscious way, but in the way of someone who had been told something for the first time that they had needed to hear for a long time. My professor at the survey school said I showed promise, she said. Your professor was understating it considerably. He was a man who found it professionally difficult to be enthusiastic about a woman's capabilities. She said it without bitterness as fact. His highest praise was that I showed promise. Then he was a fool, Elias said, and I am not. Something broke open in her expression briefly, like a window coming unstuck. And then she straightened and turned back to her work, but her movements were lighter than they had been, and she was smiling to herself in a way that she did not appear to know he could see. He could see it. He was paying attention. They rode back north with 7 days of careful survey work in Lewis's field notebooks, and 2 days out of Caldwell, they found the trouble they had known was coming. It came in the form of 4 men on the road, which was not really a road but a track, who had positioned themselves at a place where the track narrowed between a dry creek bed and a rise of limestone, and who were waiting with the studied casualness of men who had been placed there rather than happened to be there. Briggs's men. Elias recognized one of them, a large man named Cole Trawick, who had been connected to the Briggs operation for years, and who had a reputation for the kind of violence that was designed to send messages rather than kill outright. Elias pulled up 30 yards out, and Louisa pulled up beside him. She had already assessed the situation. He could see it in the way she positioned the sorrel without any obvious instruction, quartering slightly to give herself a clear line. They want the notebooks, she said quietly. Yes. They will not get them. No, he looked at the 4 men, but I would rather not use guns if there is another way. I agree. She reached into her coat and produced not a weapon but the certified copy of her land document from the Caldwell land office. She held it up where the men could see it. Gentlemen, she called out, this document is a certified copy of a registered land claim. The original is on record at the United States General Land Office in Washington as of 6 days ago. There are also photographs in the care of Marshal Deakins' office in Caldwell, taken before we departed. What you are looking for does not exist in the form you are hoping to find it. If you take our field notebooks, you will be taking surveying notes and not the evidence you are trying to suppress, because that evidence is already beyond your reach. The 4 men looked at each other. This was not the situation they had been given to expect. Furthermore, she continued, in the same clear, carrying voice, this gentleman beside me is a deputy of the marshal's office in Caldwell, and assaulting us on this road constitutes a federal offense in addition to whatever you might be charged with under territorial law. I suggest you consider your employer's intentions and your own prospects and make a wise decision. There was a long pause. Trawick, the large man, looked at Elias. Elias met his gaze and did not say anything, because Louisa had said everything that needed saying and adding to it would only diminish it. Trawick looked at Louisa. Louisa looked back at him with an expression of such calm, absolute certainty that it was, Elias thought, like watching someone hold a flame in a high wind. The flame did not bend. Trawick moved his horse off the track. The other 3 men followed. Louisa rode forward without altering her pace. Elias rode beside her, and as they passed through the gap he heard Trawick say something under his breath that he was glad Louisa did not hear, and he gave Trawick a look that conveyed very clearly what would happen if he had occasion to say it again. They rode a 1/4 mile before either of them spoke. You were right about the photographs, Elias said. Very smart. There are no photographs, Louisa said. I do not have a camera. He looked at her. She looked straight ahead, and the corners of her mouth were doing the thing he loved. You lied, he said. I implied, she corrected. The evidence is beyond their reach. That part was true. I was simply imprecise about the mechanism. A pause. Lying would be beneath me. Strategic imprecision is a different matter, he laughed. Genuinely fully, the way he had not laughed in longer than he could remember, and she looked at him with that bright window-coming unstuck expression that she kept trying to put away and kept failing to, and then she laughed too, and the sound of it in the open territory was startling and clear, and so good it almost hurt. They arrived in Caldwell with 5 days to spare before Judge Ames was expected. Those 5 days were the strangest kind of ordinary. They had supper together at Mrs. Holt's every evening. They talked. They argued about things that had nothing to do with land grants, including the proper construction of a fence line, the merits of various approaches to breaking horses, and whether the novels of Mr. Charles Dickens, whose work Louisa had read extensively, were more interesting than the natural science writing of Mr. John Muir, whose work Elias had read extensively, and whether a person was morally obligated to choose one over the other or whether reading both was not only acceptable but evidence of a well-organized mind. They agreed on the last point. Louisa prepared her case with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She had the survey maps drawn to a final clean copy. She had the certified document. She had the original survey record from the Locket. She had 3 pages of geological and botanical evidence supporting the boundary delineations. She had, after a conversation with Percy Hutchins that involved a great deal of persuasion and one strategic reference to federal law, the Land Office's original registration records from 1868, which showed that Elias Finley's claim had been filed first, and that Aldous Briggs's subsequent claim had been registered in a manner that was at minimum irregular and at maximum fraudulent. Elias spoke with Marshal Deakins, who was uncomfortable but could not argue with the evidence Louisa had assembled. He also paid a visit to Hector Briggs, who had been released as expected and was conducting himself with the aggressive confidence of a man who thought he owned the situation. "I want you to understand," Elias told him, in a meeting at Briggs's hotel room that Elias had requested with the studied courtesy that was more unnerving than anger, "that whatever happens in that courtroom, the evidence that woman has assembled will be public record. The United States General Land Office has already been notified. If Judge Ames does not rule in her favor, this matter goes to federal court in Topeka, and then it becomes not just a local land dispute but a federal case with your family's name attached to it. There is a reporter from the Caldwell Post who has expressed interest in the story. There is also a reporter from the Wichita Eagle who has expressed more interest." Briggs looked at him. "Are you threatening me?" "I am informing you," Elias said. "There is a difference. Though I understand why you might have difficulty telling them apart." Briggs's lawyer Carter, who was present, said something in Briggs's ear that Elias did not catch. Briggs's expression shifted. "The family may be willing to discuss a settlement," Carter said smoothly. "Miss Finley is not interested in a settlement," Elias said. "She is interested in what is hers." He left the hotel and went to find Louisa and tell her what had been said, and she listened and then said, "Good," in a tone that settled the matter entirely. Judge Harold Ames arrived on a Wednesday morning in October and held his court in the largest room of the Caldwell Hotel, which was set up with chairs and a table, and had enough people in it that the heat was significant. Word had gotten around. The injustice thread had a life of its own in a town like Caldwell, where most people understood the difference between a fair claim and a stolen one, and had opinions about which category this fell into. Louisa presented her case with the same calm, systematic clarity she brought to her survey work. She laid the documents before Judge Ames in order, explained each one, answered his questions with precision and without embellishment, and when Carter raised objections on Briggs's behalf she addressed each objection directly and with the specific evidence that invalidated it. Elias, sitting near the back of the room, watched Judge Ames's face as the case unfolded. Ames was a tall, thin man with a serious face and the look of someone who took his position as a point of honor. He asked good questions. He pushed back on Louisa's presentation twice, not because he disagreed, but because he wanted to see how she handled the pressure, and both times she handled it with an elegance that made the room go quiet. When Carter attempted to introduce a counter-document claiming the original survey record was a forgery, Louisa produced the geological and botanical evidence, explained the magnetic declination correction, and demonstrated point by point how the survey record's boundary descriptions correlated exactly with current physical features that could not have been known to a forger working 20 years after the original survey had been done. Judge Ames looked at Carter. "This is not a forgery," he said. Carter started to speak. "It is not a forgery," Ames repeated, with the finality of a man who has made a decision and does not see any reason to revisit it. He looked at Louisa. "Miss Finley, the evidence you have presented is thorough, professionally executed, and legally compelling. The original Clearwater grant filed by your great-uncle Silas Nathaniel Finley in 1868 is a valid land claim. The subsequent claim filed by the Briggs family is invalid, and the land records in this territory are to be amended accordingly." He looked at Hector Briggs, who had gone very still. "As for the manner in which the original claim was displaced, I will be recommending a federal review of the circumstances, which will be conducted by officers of the United States government. That recommendation will go by telegraph today." The room was quiet. Then it was not quiet. What followed was not precisely chaos, but was the frontier version of celebration, which involved a lot of voices and some hat-throwing, and at least 2 men shaking Louisa's hand so vigorously she had to ask them to stop. Percy Hutchins came to update the land records on the spot. Mrs. Holt, who had come to the hearing, produced a handkerchief. Marshal Deakins, who had also come, shook Louisa's hand with a deliberateness that suggested he was aware he had not been as helpful as he might have been, and was trying to communicate some version of belated respect. Hector Briggs left the room with Carter, and neither of them looked back. Through all of it, Elias stood near the wall and watched Louisa Finley hold the moment with the same steadiness she brought to everything, accepting congratulations and answering questions and shaking hands, and wearing on her face an expression that was not triumph, not precisely, but was something deeper and more quiet. The satisfaction of a debt paid, the relief of a thing carried a long way finally set down. When the room had thinned, she found him at the wall where he had been standing. "You did that," he said. "We did it," she said. "I told you I needed a witness and an ally. Both suited the purpose. Both suited the territory," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something she had not done before. She took the locket from around her neck and held it in her hand, just looking at it. "My grandmother kept this for 12 years, she said, waiting to send it west. She could not go herself. She was too old and the territory was too far. She had to wait for someone who could carry it and use it. She turned the locket over. I want to put a photograph of Ida Mee in here," she said. "When I get back to Ohio, I will have one made from the portrait in her house." She looked up. "Though I do not plan to go back to Ohio permanently. No. I have 1,423 acres in the Oklahoma Territory," she said. "I plan to live on them." "That is a significant undertaking," Elias said, "for one person." "Yes," she agreed, "it is." She put the locket back around her neck and looked at him with the full directness that was the most particular and most devastating thing about her. "I am not especially interested in doing it alone." There was a moment of absolute stillness. Then Elias said, "Neither am I." It was October in Caldwell, Kansas, and the man who had come west in '73 to put distance between himself and his past had just discovered that the future, which he had been deliberately not thinking about, had arrived in the form of a woman carrying a silver locket and a survey certificate, and an unbroken will that seemed to him, in that moment, like the most beautiful thing he had ever been given the opportunity to stand next to. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said. "Please," she said. "I have been falling in love with you since the morning after the boarding house, when you sat down at Mrs. Holt's table and asked me whether the county judge was corruptible in your direction." She stared at him. "I have been trying to determine whether it was appropriate to tell you," he continued, "given the circumstances and the fact that you had enough to manage without adding Elias," she said. "Yes. I have been falling in love with you since you said you understood the difference between needing a guardian and needing an ally." She paused. "And then you actually proved it, repeatedly." He looked at her. She looked at him. They were standing in the thinning crowd of a hotel room in a border town in Kansas on an October afternoon, and it was not a particularly romantic setting by conventional standards, but it was theirs, and the specific quality of what passed between them in that moment required no setting at all. He took her hand. She let him. "Come and have supper with me," he said. "At the restaurant, not Mrs. Holt's, with wine if they have it." "They have rye whiskey," she said. "We will make do," he said. They made do beautifully. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was the winter they built what they were going to be. They spent it in Caldwell, because travel to the territory in winter was impractical, and because there was paperwork to file and legal steps to complete and a federal review to cooperate with, and because it turned out that spending a winter in a small town with someone you were falling in love with was not a hardship in the slightest. Louisa set up a surveying practice out of a small office she rented on 2nd Street. Word spread the way word spreads in frontier towns, which is fast and in all directions, and within 6 weeks she had more work than she could complete in the winter. Ranchers who needed boundary surveys, homesteaders who needed claim documentation, a mining company representative who came up from the territory with questions about mineral rights that she answered so thoroughly he went away and came back with a formal contract. She worked. She was always working, or reading, or thinking, and Elias found that living alongside that level of industrious, precise intelligence was not exhausting, as he might once have imagined, but energizing, because her attention was so complete when she gave it that receiving it felt like standing in full sunlight. He expanded his operation at the ranch, broke the 3 horses he had been meaning to break, repaired the fence line. He also, in a decision that surprised even himself, began studying land law from a book he ordered from a legal publisher in St. Louis, because Louisa had identified several ways in which the existing territorial land law was insufficient to protect legitimate claims, and he found that listening to her explain legal gaps was interesting in a way that reading about it himself made more useful. They argued about things. They agreed about more things. They had suppers that lasted 2 hours and walks along the creek in the early dark of the short winter days, and long conversations that began on practical topics and ended in places neither of them had expected. He told her everything about the war years and the years after. She told him everything about her father and her grandmother, and the experience of being the woman who showed up with the best marks in the class and was told she showed promise and nothing more. She told him about the man in Columbus who had courted her with great enthusiasm, until he understood that she intended to pursue her profession after marriage, and then courted someone else with equal enthusiasm. She said it without self-pity, and he felt the familiar tightening at the back of his jaw that came when he thought about people who had failed to see her clearly. "He missed out," Elias said. "He did," she agreed pleasantly, "though I suspect he is happier with someone who does not correct his arithmetic at the dinner table. I do not mind you correcting my arithmetic. You do not have any arithmetic to correct. You are unnervingly competent at mathematics for someone who has never taken a formal course. I had a good school teacher until I was 12, he said. After that I taught myself from whatever I could find. Like everything else, she said. Like everything else, he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. I like that about you, she said, that you built yourself. Not everyone can do that. You did it, he said. I had my father and my grandmother. I had people who believed in me. She paused. You had nothing and you built something anyway. That is, she stopped. What? That is the kind of thing, she said carefully, that I find it very difficult not to love. He looked at her across the table of the restaurant that had become theirs by habit, and the firelight on her face was the same as the firelight in the territory, but different, warmer, more intimate, and he thought, I am going to ask her to marry me before this winter is out. He did it in February, on a Sunday afternoon when the snow had thickened the air into white silence, and Mrs. Holt's boarding house was the warmest place in Caldwell, and they were sitting in the common room with the fire going, and Louisa was reading a paper on geological survey methodology in the Oklahoma Territory, and Elias was watching her read it, and had been watching her read it for approximately 15 minutes while thinking about how to say what he wanted to say. "Louisa, I want to marry you." She looked up, set the paper down with care, looked at him with those dark, direct eyes that missed nothing. "Tell me why," she said. He had expected this. He had been thinking about it for weeks. "Because you are the most honest person I have ever known, and because your honesty does not hurt people, it just makes things clear. Because you are braver than anyone I have ever ridden with, and you do not perform the bravery, you just do what needs doing. Because you correct my arithmetic when I have arithmetic and I find I want to be with someone who will correct my arithmetic. Because this winter has been the best winter of my life." He paused. "Because I love you. And because I think you love me, and because I think that is not something either of us planned for and that neither of us can do anything about, and because I would rather build something with you than do anything else the world is currently offering me." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he became aware of the fire and the snow outside and the sound of his own heartbeat. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Yes, Elias, I will marry you." She picked up the paper and then set it down again decisively. "I have conditions," he smiled. "Of course you do. I keep my name professionally, Louisa Finley, when I am working, Louisa Walden elsewhere if that is what we decide. I retain the right to practice my profession without limitation, and we build on the Clearwater land together, both of us. It is mine by law, but I want it to be ours in every way that matters." "Those are not conditions," he said. "Those are things I would have suggested myself." She looked at him for a moment. Then she got up from her chair and came to sit beside him on the settle, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him with a completeness of trust that he understood was not easily given, and that he intended to spend a considerable number of years deserving. "My grandmother would have liked you," she said. "I know," he said. "She had excellent judgment." They married in March of 1881 at the Caldwell church, with Mrs. Holt and Percy Hutchins and Marshall Deakins in attendance, and 3 of Elias' ranch hands who cleaned up tolerably well and were genuinely pleased, and a few of Louis's clients from the surveying practice who had become something like friends over the winter months. Louisa wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Wichita, practical and well-made, and she wore the locket at her throat, and she walked to the front of the church under her own power with her chin level and her eyes clear, and looked at Elias with an expression of such complete and considered certainty that the minister, who was a sentimental man, had to collect himself before he could begin. Elias had bought a ring in the Kansas City style, a simple gold band with a small setting. When he put it on her hand, she looked at it with the same attention she gave everything, checking its fit, confirming it was real, and then she looked up at him and smiled, fully and without reservation, the kind of smile she did not give the world generally, but that he had been accumulating like treasure for 5 months. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house because the weather had not yet broken enough for travel, and the following week they began making preparations to move to the Clearwater Grant. Spring came to the Oklahoma Territory the way it always did, with an excess of enthusiasm and a great deal of mud, and the Waldens arrived at their land in April with a wagon loaded with the essentials of beginning: tools, seed, lumber for the first structure, Louis's surveying equipment, Elias' books and her books intermingled in 2 crates, and a milk cow that Elias had acquired from a neighboring rancher on the grounds that you could not build a future without a cow. The first thing Louisa did when they arrived was stand at the northern boundary near Red Cedar Ridge and look south over 1,400 acres of raw red-soiled, sky-wide, completely unfinished territory, and she stood there long enough that Elias came to stand beside her. "All right," he asked. "I am thinking about where to put things," she said. He had learned by now to let her think. He stood beside her and looked south and tried to see it the way she did, the invisible lines of what it was going to be overlaid on the reality of what it was. "House site should be on the high ground," she said. protected from the northern winds by the ridge, access to the spring. Good visibility to the south and east. She pointed. There, he looked. It was the right place. He had come to the same conclusion himself the week before, but had been curious to see if she would reach the same spot. There, he agreed. They built the house over the summer with help from 2 men Elias hired from a nearby settlement, Comanche Jack, who was a mixed heritage carpenter of exceptional skill, and a Swedish homesteader named Lars Eriksson, who could pour a foundation and frame a wall faster than anyone Elias had ever seen. The house went up in sections, first the main room and kitchen, then the sleeping room, then the porch that faced south and gave them the long view down the valley. Louisa surveyed the entire property with the thoroughness she had applied during the legal proceedings, this time not for the court but for themselves, producing maps and plans that became the working blueprint for everything they intended to build. She designed the pasture divisions. She identified the most productive sections for grazing and planned the stock management accordingly. She surveyed what she had identified as potential coal seams in the southern section and wrote a detailed report that she sent to 3 geological publications in the east, one of which published it, which brought her to the attention of a geological survey team from the University of Kansas who wrote to inquire whether she would consult on their territorial work. She wrote back. She consulted. She did not stop being Louisa Finley, licensed surveyor, while also becoming Louisa Walden, rancher's wife, and she did not find these identities in conflict, partly because Elias had never suggested they should be, and partly because she had long since decided that anyone who found them in conflict was wrong rather than something she needed to accommodate. Their first child was born in the spring of 1882, a boy they named Samuel William Walden, Samuel for Elias' brother who had died too young, and William for Louisa's father. He arrived in the world with Elias' build and Louisa's eyes, and what appeared from the first weeks of his life to be his mother's absolute opinion about everything. Elias delivered him with the steady, focused competence he brought to difficult situations, and when it was over and the baby was bundled and Louisa was exhausted and relieved and looking at the small face with an expression that was so purely overwhelmed he had to look away for a moment to compose himself, she said, "You are going to have to build a bigger house." "I was already planning to," he said. "I know," she said. "I drew the plans last month." He laughed, softly, careful not to wake the baby, and she smiled at him with the smile that was only his, and outside the window of the bedroom that faced south the Oklahoma Territory was green and gold in the spring morning, and entirely unconcerned with the small, world-changing event that had just occurred inside that room. They did build the bigger house. Lars Eriksson came back to do the framing and brought his own family, who had settled 6 miles east, and the expansion of the house took the better part of the summer of 1882, with Louisa directing the layout with the precision of someone who had given considerable thought to every room and its relationship to every other room, and its relationship to the light at different times of day. She was not wrong about any of it. She rarely was. Samuel grew into a loud, energetic child who learned to walk early and immediately applied this ability to the project of getting into everything in the house, and then in the yard, and then in the pasture. He had his mother's appetite for understanding how things worked and his father's patience for the slow parts of the process, which was an unusual combination in a 2-year-old and kept both of them constantly engaged. The Clearwater Ranch grew. They added cattle in the second year, 20 head to start, expanding to 60 by the third. The coal seams in the southern section turned out to be more substantial than Louisa had initially estimated, and she negotiated a mineral rights lease with a Kansas City mining company that provided income without requiring them to manage the extraction themselves. The geological consulting work continued and expanded. She was by 1883 considered one of the foremost field surveyors in the Southern Territories. a fact that the University of Kansas Geological Department acknowledged in a letter that gave Elias enormous pleasure, and that he kept in the desk drawer alongside the first version of her survey maps of the Clearwater Grant. The federal review of the original Briggs land fraud had proceeded slowly, as federal things do, but it concluded in 1882 with a finding that Aldous Briggs's original claim had been filed fraudulently, and that several other properties in the territory had been acquired through similar methods. Hector Briggs, who had largely disappeared from public view after the Caldwell hearing, was found to have continued some of his father's practices and faced consequences that, while not as complete as they might ideally have been, were significant enough that the Briggs name ceased to carry its former weight in the territory. Louisa heard the news of the federal conclusion in a letter from Percy Hutchins, and read it at the breakfast table, and set it down and picked up her coffee and said nothing for a while. "Finished?" Elias asked. "Mostly," she said. "The men who were here first, the Kiowa and the Cheyenne, they were removed from this land before Silas Finley ever filed a claim on it. That is not resolved by this ruling. That will not be resolved by any ruling I am likely to see in my lifetime." She paused. "That sits badly." "It should," Elias said. "I want to do something," she said. "You usually do," he said, not unkindly. "I want to support the legal challenges, the work that people like Standing Bear are doing, the cases that are going through the courts." She looked at him directly. "I know it is not directly our fight." "It is everyone's fight," Elias said. "What do you need?" She looked at him for a moment with something that was not surprise exactly, but was the continuous, quiet renewal of gratitude for the specific way he was, the way he never said that is your thing and not mine, never required her to justify caring about an injustice by explaining how it touched her personally. "I need you to agree," she said. "You have it," he said. They contributed money and their names as supporters to the legal efforts being mounted on behalf of the displaced nations, and Louisa wrote several detailed letters to lawyers in Washington explaining the land survey aspects of the territorial acquisitions, which were apparently useful enough that two of the lawyers wrote back at length with questions that she answered over the course of several weeks. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. She knew that. She did it anyway, because doing something toward an injustice, even something small, was better than doing nothing, and because Ida Mae Finley had spent 12 years doing something small about an injustice that no one else was attending to. Their second child came in 1884, a girl they named Ida Mae Walden, for the grandmother who had started all of this with a letter and a locket, and the particular courage of someone who has very little time left and chooses to use it making trouble for the people who deserve it. Little Ida had her mother's dark hair and her father's stillness, and, early and obviously, her own will, which was formidable and entirely her own, and not derived from either of her parents, except in the way that things are derived from people who model them faithfully for long enough. Louisa had not been able to put the photograph of her grandmother inside the locket during the Ohio years, because there had been no photograph to use. But after Ida was born, she wrote to her father, who was still living in Columbus, and her father found in Ida Mae's house a daguerreotype of the old woman at perhaps 60 years old, sharp-eyed and straight-backed, and looking at the camera with an expression that Louisa recognized as her own expression at its most decided. Her father had the daguerreotype photographed and sent her a small print. Louisa opened the locket and replaced the portrait of the unidentified woman on one side with the photograph of her grandmother, and placed the original survey record, now returned from the land office after certification, back on the other side, and closed the locket. She sat at the table in the house on the Clearwater Grant with the locket in her hand, and the territory visible through the window, and little Samuel playing noisily in the yard and baby Ida asleep in the next room, and Elias at the desk across the room reading the Kansas City paper, and she felt, with a completeness that she had not entirely expected, that the carrying was done. The thing carried had arrived. The debt paid was paid. She had come west with her grandmother's locket and her own unbroken will. Both had suited the territory. Elias looked up from his paper. He had always been able to sense when she was thinking something she was not saying yet, some internal settling that was almost visible if you knew where to look. "What?" he asked. "I was thinking about my grandmother," she said, "about what she was imagining when she sent me here." "What do you think she was imagining?" "Not this," Louisa said. "Not exactly. She did not know you. She could not have planned for you." She looked down at the locket. "But I think she imagined me standing on this land. I think that is what she was sending me toward, a place to stand." "And?" Elias asked. She looked up at him. Around them the house was warm and the territory was wide, and the future was the specific, detailed, well-surveyed kind of future that Louisa Finley Walden built everything into, one careful, precise, purposeful step at a time. "I have it," she said. "The place to stand." He came across the room and sat beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she had that first night against the sandstone. And the locket was warm in her hand. And outside in the yard little Samuel shrieked with delight at something. A prairie dog was doing near the fence. And Elias' hand covered hers over the silver oval of the locket. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because nothing else was needed. In the years that followed, the Clearwater Ranch became something that both of them could see whole and be proud of. The cattle herd grew to healthy numbers. The mineral rights income gave them stability that allowed them to improve the land rather than merely work it. Louisa's consulting practice expanded again in 1886 when the railroad came south through the territory and required survey work of a complexity that she was uniquely equipped to provide. She hired 2 assistants, one of whom was a young woman of 22 named Rosa Cahill, who had the same mathematical aptitude that Louisa had shown at that age, and who Louisa taught with the deliberate, enthusiastic seriousness that her own father had once taught her. Samuel started school in 1887, riding to the small territorial school 6 miles east with Lars Ericsson's children, and coming home full of opinions about history and geography and things his teachers had said that he wanted to debate. Louisa debated with him at the supper table with genuine pleasure, while Elias and little Ida listened with varying degrees of comprehension and participation. Ida generally coming down on her mother's side out of some instinct that her mother was usually right that turned out, over time, to be well-founded. Elias' ranch hands. The operation had grown to the point where they had 3 full-time hands and additional help during roundup, were a loyal and respectful bunch who had understood early on that Louisa Walden was not the rancher's wife in a decorative sense, but was the person who had designed the pasture system they worked every day and who could look at a fence line and tell you within 10 minutes where its weaknesses were and why. They addressed her accordingly. There was a moment in the fall of 1887 when Elias was mending a section of that fence in the north pasture, and one of the hands, a young man named Corbett who had come up from Texas, said almost to himself, "She is something, your wife." "She is," Elias agreed. "I have worked for ranches in 3 territories," Corbett said. "I have never met anyone who knew land the way she does. She looks at it like she can see through it." "She can," Elias said. "More or less." Corbett thought about that. "How did you get so lucky?" he asked, in the tone of someone genuinely curious rather than insolent. Elias thought about it honestly. "I walked through a door at the right time," he said. "And I paid attention to what I found on the other side." Corbett looked like he was filing this away as advice. The winter of 1888 was a hard one, harder than any they had experienced since arriving. A blizzard in January brought 3 feet of snow to the territory in 48 hours and killed 12 of their cattle before they could get them to shelter. It was the kind of loss that smaller operations did not recover from, and it tested them the way the territory periodically tested everyone who tried to build something in it. They managed. They sold the mineral rights lease at a renegotiated rate that compensated for the livestock losses. Louisa took on additional survey contracts in the spring. Elias drove the surviving herd hard through the recovery season and rebuilt the numbers by fall. They did all of this without catastrophizing the setback, and without giving up any part of what they had built. And when October came again, and the grant was still theirs, and the house was still standing, and the children were healthy, and the work was ongoing, Louisa sat on the south porch in the evening light and looked at the valley with the expression Elias had learned to read as the purest form of her satisfaction. He brought her coffee, which had replaced the rye whiskey of their Caldwell days as the evening beverage of choice, and sat beside her. "We made it through," he said. "We did," she said. "And next year we add 30 head back to the north section." "I was thinking 40, he said. 35, she said. He smiled. She was already right, and they both knew it. She had the carrying capacity of the north section calculated to the decimal. 35, he agreed. In 1889, when Samuel was 7 and Ida was 5, their third child arrived. A boy again, whom they named Elias Thomas Walden, and called Thomas from the first to prevent confusion, Thomas being Elias' father's name, a small reconciliation with a history that had never required formal closing. Thomas arrived in spring, and was from the beginning a quiet, observant child who sat still, and watched the world with his father's stillness and his mother's precision, and who at 3 years old could sit for 20 minutes watching a hawk circle over the south pasture without being called away by anything. The locket hung in its place above the mantelpiece when Louisa was not wearing it, visible from most of the main room. The children knew the story of it the way they knew the story of everything that mattered to their family, thoroughly and often, told on winter evenings when the fire was high, and the territory was dark and close around the house, and the world felt small and complete in the best possible sense. Samuel particularly liked the part where his mother told 3 men that there were photographs in Marshal Deakins' office when there were no photographs at all. "That was a lie," he said, at age 8, in the tone of someone who wanted clarification. "Strategic imprecision," his mother said, with the expression that his father recognized and that Samuel was beginning to understand was a very particular kind of amusement. "What is the difference?" "The evidence actually was beyond Briggs's reach," Louisa said. "That part was completely true. I was simply imprecise about how." Samuel thought about this for a long moment. "That is very clever," he decided. "It was necessary," his mother said. "Clever and necessary are different things. Clever is about being interesting. Necessary is about doing what needs to be done. When they happen to coincide, that is satisfying." Samuel filed this away. He was already showing signs of his mother's mathematical aptitude and his father's ranching instinct in equal measure, and Louisa was beginning to think with some pleasure about the possibility that, when the time came, he might take on both the ranch and a profession alongside it, in the way she herself had done. The 1890s were quieter years in the way that years become quiet when you have built enough to stop bracing against collapse and can instead attend to the texture of what you have made. Louisa continued her consulting work, scaled to the seasons of the ranch and the family. Elias took on the management of a small cooperative of neighboring ranches that had formed to share resources during difficult seasons, which gave him a role in the wider territory that suited his combination of practical competence and quiet authority. Percy Hutchins came to visit in 1891 and brought them his retirement announcement and a bottle of good whiskey to celebrate both the announcement and the anniversary of the Caldwell hearing, which he had apparently marked in his calendar for a decade. He was a sentimental man, it turned out, underneath the 3 pairs of spectacles and the bureaucratic caution. Marshal Deakins died in 1892 of the drinking that had always been going to catch up with him eventually. Elias attended the funeral and said something brief and honest at the graveside about a man who had not always been brave but who had, when the moment required it, done the right thing. It was a fair accounting. Louisa's father, William Finley, came west to visit in 1893, the first time he had traveled so far, and he stood in the main room of the house on the Clearwater grant and looked at the survey maps on the wall and the books on the shelves and the 3 children who were his grandchildren and Elias Walden, who was his son-in-law. and he had the expression of a man who is looking at something he had hoped for but not been entirely certain of. "Your mother would have loved this," he said to Louisa quietly in the kitchen. "I know," Louisa said. "So would grandmother." "Grandmother would have taken credit for it," William said, with the fond precision of someone who loved a person clearly. "She would have been right to," Louisa said. William Finley shook Elias' hand the morning he left and held it for a moment with the grip of a man conveying something that did not require words, and Elias received it the same way, and that was the understanding between them. The locket survived everything. It survived the hard winter of 1888 and the dust storms of 1886 and the summer of 1891, when a grass fire came within half a mile of the north boundary, and they spent 3 terrifying days watching the smoke and keeping the horses ready. It survived the ordinary losses of a working life in rough country, livestock and equipment, and the hired hand who had been a friend, and was thrown from a horse one morning and did not get up again. It survived, and it stayed silver and worn smooth in the places where hands had held it most often, because Louisa held it often, on ordinary evenings and on difficult days, and on the mornings when she stood on the south porch before the family was awake and looked at the valley and felt, as she always felt in those moments, the gratitude and the responsibility of having built something on the land her grandmother had given her. In 1895, she opened the locket for the first time in years and looked at the photograph of Ida Mee on one side, sharp-eyed, straight-backed, everything that Louisa had inherited and built upon, and at the original survey record on the other side, small and thin and still legible, the document that had traveled from Ohio in a silver locket to a border town in Kansas to a courthouse hearing, and then to the land it had described and justified. And she thought that her grandmother had been right about everything, including the part she had said at the very end. Both suited the territory. She closed the locket and put it back around her neck and went inside to wake the children for breakfast, because Samuel had school and Ida had been promised a lesson in compass reading, and Thomas, at 6, was beginning to ask questions about numbers that deserved real answers. And the morning was clear, and the territory was green from the spring rains, and Elias was already in the kitchen making coffee with the focused domestic competence he brought to that particular task, because he had decided years ago that if he was going to drink coffee every morning for the rest of his life, he might as well make it well. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. He looked up. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Outside the south window the valley ran away into the distance, all of it mapped and surveyed and accounted for, every boundary feature known and recorded, 1,423 acres that were theirs in the full sense of the word, earned and documented and built upon and loved in the specific way that only people who have fought for a thing know how to love it. The locket rested at her throat, warm from the wearing of it. Elias Walden poured her coffee and handed it across the distance between them, and she took it, and that was how every morning began, with that small exchange in the kitchen of the house they had built on the land her grandmother had sent her west to claim, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything the territory had to offer, and it was everything they had made of it, and it was good.